Okay, so now we've come to a point where we can discuss the overall activity of the heart. The heart itself continually repeats the same set of instances, same set of activities over and over and over again as it continues to function. And this is referred to as your cardiac cycle as far as what's contracting when and why. So the record of the activity of the heart that repeats over and over and over again every time an action potential travels through it is referred to as your cardiac cycle. Your cardiac cycle typically requires about 0.8 seconds on average. And what we see happening is we have a series of events where we start with atrial contraction, followed by atrial relaxation. At the same time, we have ventricular contraction, and then ventricular relaxation. And then we have the whole cycle repeating itself. Some new terms that you're going to want to be familiar with: systole is the new term that we use to reference when the heart is in a contracted state, whereas diastole is a term, or diastole is a term used to reference when the heart is in a relaxed state. Now, what we're going to see is the whole contraction and relaxation of the heart is going to result in pressure changes. And these pressure changes are important because they are what direct blood to flow. So blood flows, or blood moves throughout the body from areas of high pressure to low pressure. And in the heart, this is true unless there's a valve in the way preventing it. Now, what we can see is the record of the cardiac cycle looks something similar to this. And what you're going to see is, although this graph tends to be scary, it has some very, very useful information to it. First, up here we have pressure. You'll notice that, and this is representative of the left side of the heart only. Okay, but realize what's happening on the left is identical to what's happening on the right side of the heart. So we can actually just focus on one side and realize that what's happening on the opposite side is the same. Now, here we have pressure changes, and notice we have pressure in the left atrium, left ventricle, and aorta. And blood will always flow from an area of high pressure to low pressure unless there's a valve in the way. For example, here we have aortic pressure. Well, notice aortic pressure is higher than ventricular pressure, so you'd think blood would be flowing backwards. But it's not, because we have the aortic semilunar valve. Okay. Now, you can go ahead and stay on this page in your notes, and I'm actually going to bring up a white screen so we can go through the different stages of cardiac activity and see if we can make sense of this cardiac cycle. Now, we're going to start with when the heart is completely relaxed. Okay? So the first stage is going to be atrial diastole, AD, and then ventricular diastole. Now I'm going to draw my little heart here. Yeah, I know it's another box, but bear with me. Now at this point, both the atria and the ventricles are relaxed. If we look at our diagram, when we look at our graph, when both chambers are relaxed, what we're going to see is, and this is an approximation, but we're going to see the pressure down here in the ventricles about 10 millimeters of mercury. The pressure up here in the atria, about 15 millimeters of mercury, and the pressure here in the aorta, about 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Now at this point, blood, two key things. Blood is going to want to flow in two areas. It's going to want to flow in this direction, and it's going to want to flow in this direction. Now only one of those we want to occur. We want blood flowing from the atria to the ventricles, but we do not want blood flowing from the aorta to the ventricles. So this is where we see the semilunar valve closing and preventing that. Okay. So during atrial diastole and ventricular diastole, we have a pressure gradient where the atrioventricular valve is open. This is the period when the heart is completely relaxed and when the majority of ventricular filling occurs. Okay, so this is the time when the majority of ventricular filling is occurring. Sorry about that, folks. I don't know why that's occurring. Oh, I was actually accidentally pushing the wrong button. Okay, so I guess I'm going to have to go redraw that, so bear with me, folks. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and let me just redraw that real quick. So we have an open AV valve and a closed semilunar valve because the pressure here is 80, pressure down here is 10. We do not want blood flowing backwards from the aorta, so we're going to close this valve. But we do want blood flowing from the atria to ventricles, so our AV valve is open. And again, we said this was ventricular filling. And this is when about 80% of ventricular filling occurs on average. So the next thing we're going to move to is atrial systole. Again, at this point, ventricles still in a relaxed state. At this point, we call the atria begin to relax, begin to contract. And when they contract, this increases the pressure. Okay, this increases the pressure up here. So it's going to spike up to about 20 or so millimeters of mercury. Pressure down here is still 10. It might rise slightly to about 15, but the key, it's still less than the atria, so we're going to continue and finish pumping any of that last little bit of blood from the atria into the ventricles. At this point, the aortic pressure is still high, so we want to make sure that semilunar valve is still closed. And this is when we finish ventricular filling. That remaining 20% gets pushed on in. From here, we now switch to atrial diastole, but we begin ventricular systole. So we're going to start ventricular contraction. First thing's going to happen, okay, is our pressure up here is going to be 20. Pressure in here is 80, okay? Means our semilunar valve is still closed. First thing that's going to happen, though, is our ventricular pressure is going to go from 15, where it ended over here, up to 21. Well, the second we reach 21, blood's going to want to start moving back into the atria. And do we want that? Nope, we do not. So what we need to do is, as soon as we hit 21, our AV valve closes. As soon as we hit 21, our AV valve closes. But here's the thing. Notice, we've hit 21, so we've closed our AV valve. AV meaning atrioventricular valve. But we have not yet got a pressure high enough to open our semilunar valve. Now we have a fixed volume of blood. In this ventricle. And this fixed volume of blood in the ventricle that was present at the end of ventricular relaxation is referred to as end diastolic volume. And this is the maximum amount of blood the heart has during this cycle to eject, because it's not going to get any more until the next cycle starts. Now we've got a period of time. If we come over here, may have to get a little smaller. Okay, so now we're still, this period of atrial diastole ventricular systole kind of occurs, or I'm going to draw out in 3 different stages. So now we have our next one. Atrial, still in, where we have our atria. So now we've made it to 21, but we're contracting, and we're making it up to 79. Well, at this point, we're still, all valves are closed. And as long as we are in this pressure range between 21 and 79, all valves are going to remain closed. Now, since we're increasing in pressure, we call this period of time, with all valves being closed, we call it isovolumetric contraction. And this period of time is referred to as isovolumetric contraction because we've got all valves closed, which means the volume is not changing, it's staying the same, hence iso. And it's staying the same as the heart contracts more and more and more to try and build up that pressure to open that semilunar valve. Okay, let's go ahead and go on to our final component to our atrial diastole ventricular systole with, gotta make more room, with the third step. And again, we're still up here at 20-ish. Okay, at this point we now are at 81. We've contracted and we're going to contract all the way up to 120. Well, since we are at 80, we now have opened our semilunar valve. We are exceeding the pressure in the aorta, and blood will leave the heart. This is referred to as ventricular ejection. And this is going to occur as long as the ventricular pressure is higher than the aortic pressure. Okay, well now let's talk about how we get the heart back to its relaxed state. So again, atrial diastole, ventricular diastole 1. First thing that's going to happen is our pressure is going to fall from 120 down to 79. Remember, pressure up here is 80. So once we hit 79, blood's going to want to go back this way. We don't want that, so we got to close this valve. Okay, now we're at 79. Pressure up here is still 20. We can't open, this valve isn't going to open yet until we drop the pressure even further. So now we again have an amount of blood in here that is not changing. And this volume of blood that is left over after ventricular contraction is referred to as your end systolic volume. Okay. Excuse me. And this end systolic volume remains unchanged as long as we are below aortic pressure but above atrial pressure. Now this pressure has to continue to fall until it hits 19. So again, we have a period of time when all valves are closed. And this period of time when all valves are closed and the amount of blood in the chamber is not changing, just like before, is called our isovolumetric. But in this case, since we are trying to drop the pressure, it's referred to as isovolumetric relaxation. Well, now once we've dropped down to 19 on down to 10, we're up at 20 to 15, okay? At this point, we're below the pressure, and we return to ventricular filling. And the cycle repeats. Now, you might ask yourself, why do we care about these volumes? Okay, right here we have our end diastolic volume. Down here we have our end systolic volume. Well, why do we care about these amounts of blood? How is that useful to us? Well, think about it. If we know how much blood we started out with, and we know how much blood is left, we can now calculate what left the heart. This is referred to as stroke volume. So again, we can take a look at what we started with and what we have left over, and we now know the amount of blood that left the heart. And this is referred to as stroke volume, which is equal to end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume, and is the amount of blood that left the heart in one beat. Now, we look at the cardiac cycle and it's a snapshot of a single event, but we don't, one single contraction cycle isn't going to be enough to keep us going throughout the day. We need that contraction cycle to repeat itself, and we need to be able to discuss or kind of, get an idea of what kind of rate at which we need these things to happen in order to know what we need the heart to do or to accomplish at any one time. So we have to look at the rate at which the heart can accomplish its job, and this is referred to as cardiac output. Cardiac output can be defined in two ways. It can be defined via an equation, and it can be defined via a verbal definition. And make sure you know both, because it's amazing how many students can recite this equation for cardiac output but not understand what it represents. And it is important that you understand what it represents. So cardiac output is defined as the volume of blood ejected from the left or the right ventricle into the aorta or pulmonary trunk each minute. Well, in order to calculate cardiac output, we have to know how many times it beats in a minute, right? heart rate, and we need to know how much blood leaves the heart in one single beat. So that's where we get the definition, or the equation for cardiac output, which is heart rate times stroke volume. Now what we see is we're going to have to adjust the activities of cardiac output depending on your body's needs. Cardiac output is going to need to be able to go up during exercise or emergency situations or fight or flight situations, and we're going to want cardiac output to go down during rest and digest, while you're sleeping, during non-emergent relaxation periods. So how do we monitor? How do we adjust this? Well, we adjust cardiac output overall by adjusting both heart rate and stroke volume. We've already talked about how we adjust heart rate via the autonomic nervous system, so we'll review that here shortly, and then we'll talk about how we can adjust stroke volume in order to adjust cardiac output. So, in review, we can adjust the heart rate via autonomic stimulation, starting first with the parasympathetic. Now, parasympathetic has what's referred to as a negative chronotropic effect on the heart. Anytime you see the term chrono, this is referring to or referencing timing, okay, of an organ. And since it's negative, it's going to slow the timing of the heart. Now, as you recall from previous lectures, parasympathetic stimulation does this by releasing acetylcholine from the vagus nerve. I'm going to go ahead and just read through this somewhat slowly, but feel free to rewind and repeat as necessary, or go back to some of your earlier notes where it was written out for you. Okay. So the parasympathetic stimulation occurs when the vagus nerve releases acetylcholine onto your muscarinic receptors. Binding of acetylcholine to your muscarinic receptors increases the outward potassium permeability, which fights the pacemaker potential and slows your heart rate. Sympathetic stimulation, on the other hand, has a positive chronotropic effect, which means it increases the timing of the heart and the heart rate. Sympathetic stimulation occurs when cardiac accelerator nerves release norepinephrine. Norepinephrine then binds to beta-1 receptors within the SA and AV nodes. Opening of beta-1 receptors increases the inward sodium permeability, which enhances or adds to your pacemaker potential, causing the fibers to reach threshold more quickly and speed up your heart rate. Now, in addition to having a positive chronotropic effect, your sympathetic stimulation also has a positive ionotropic effect. This is something we'll talk about again here shortly in the regulation of contractility. Now, anything that increases is an ionotropic agent, affects the contractility of the heart. Now, as the name implies, if we're targeting contractility, we're targeting how forceful the heart contracts. And since it's a positive ionotropic agent, it's going to make the heart contract more forcefully, and it does this by increasing calcium delivery to ventricular myocardium. Now, as you recall, the availability of calcium inside your contractile cells determines how many of those actin and myosin are bound. And the more actin and myosin that are bound, the more forceful that muscle contraction is. And that's where we see this coming into play. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can adjust stroke volume. Okay, the primary regulator of stroke volume is going to be described according to Frank Starling's law of the heart. And that is two individuals, Frank and Starling. Now, Frank Starling's law of the heart describes the effect of preload on the heart. And it states that the greater the preload, the greater the force of contraction. Now, why is this? Well, preload can be simplified to reference the degree of stretch of the ventricular mass. Okay, the idea here is similar to a rubber band. The stronger you, or the further you stretch that rubber band, the farther it will go when you release it. The same is true for your heart. If we stretch that muscle slightly before contraction, it's going to have a more forceful recoil contraction and as a result a higher contractility. Now the question is, how do we stretch the ventricle? Well, you stretch it by putting more blood into it, which is why preload is proportional to end diastolic volume. As you put more and more blood into that heart, by increasing end diastolic volume, you stretch that ventricle slightly. And by stretching the ventricle, you get a nice recoil contraction along with your regular contraction, and as a result, a more forceful contraction, which means you squeeze out more blood. Okay. Now, this also explains why we can make the statement that whatever happens on one side of the heart is identical to what happens on the other. The reason being is, let's say we start out with increased end diastolic volume in the left ventricle. Well, this increase in end diastolic volume in the left ventricle leads to increase in preload. Told you I can't talk and spell at the same time, even the simplest words. This increase in preload leads to an increase in stroke volume. Well, this increase in stroke volume eventually ends up on the right side of the heart. Okay, where it leads to an increase in end diastolic volume of the right ventricle. Well, that increase in end diastolic volume of the right ventricle leads to an increase in the preload of the right ventricle. And finally, an increase in stroke volume of the right ventricle. Well, that increase in stroke volume eventually leads to an increase in end diastolic volume of the left ventricle. And we have this never-ending figure 8, which is how we can always equalize what's happening in the left versus the right ventricle. Okay, and this is why it's so easy for us to simply say that we can, talk about what's happening in the left side versus the right, because it's identical. Now here's the problem though. You might be thinking, okay, great, a little bit of stretch is good, but what happens to that rubber band when you stretch it too much? Okay. Now, a little bit of stretch is good, but too much stretch is actually bad. Okay. Now, a little bit of stretch, what it's doing is getting the maximum use of overlap in that sarcomere. Okay, but if we stretch too much, then there's not enough overlap between the actin and myosin for an adequate contraction. So, Frank Starling's law of the heart and this idea of the greater the preload, the greater the force of contraction does have its limits. Because if you stretch too much, you'll actually start to go down the other end of the slope, the other side of the hill, and start decreasing contractility as we lose too much overlap. Okay. Now we have contractility. Contractility is the strength of the contraction, which is most notably related to calcium availability. Now, the agents that affect contractility, as I've already mentioned, are referenced as ionotropic agents. Things that increase contractility include positive chronotropic agents, which would be anything that increased calcium the calcium delivery to the myocardium. Okay. Now, anything that did the opposite of that would be a negative ionotropic agent. So things that block calcium influx. Are going to be a negative ionotropic agent. And also sometimes increased extracellular potassium concentrations, because this makes repolarization difficult. Finally, we have afterload. Afterload, it has an opposing effect on stroke volume. So as afterload increases, we'll see a decrease in stroke volume. Okay, now why is that? Afterload is the pressure that must be overcome in order to open up that semilunar valve. Now, as you saw in our discussion of the cardiac cycle, normally the aortic pressure is 80, right? Which means as soon as we hit 81 down here in the ventricle, we're ejecting blood. But let's say you're suffering from hypertension, and now the pressure in the aorta is up here at 100. Are you opening at 81 anymore? No, now you got to get to 101, and 101 to open that valve, which means your heart spends more time getting the valve open, less time ejecting blood. This is why afterload has a negative impact on stroke volume. Now, in this case, we're talking about hypertension as being the reason why the semilunar valve is hard to open. But there are other reasons why that could be the case, including valve stenosis, which is when the valve is hardened. If that valve is hardened, it doesn't want to open as easily, and that will also increase afterload. So here we have some questions. Go ahead and take a second, read through, pause if you need to, and let's see what you come up with. So, increased preload will cause the heart to stretch, which increases contractility. Enlarged heart tends to have a decreased cardiac output. Why? Well, think about this. If you have an enlarged heart, that means you can hold more blood, which means, I'm going to stretch more. Well, isn't more stretching always better? Remember what we said about stretching. Too much stretching is bad because we lose overlap in our sarcomere and contractility decreases. So this is a bad thing. Finally, we've talked about how we regulate cardiac activity, but we haven't talked about when we need to do this regulation, or how do we know we need to make these changes. So finally, let's talk a little bit about how we make these regulatory changes, or how we know when to make these regulatory changes. So we monitor a variety of aspects to the cardiovascular center, to our cardiovascular system, in order to decide if changes are necessary to cardiac output and heart activity. Now, we monitor those with we use three primary sensory receptors in order to do that monitoring. And that's going to be your proprioceptors, chemoreceptors, and baroreceptors. Now, those receptors are constantly taking note of the activity of our body as far as what it's doing when, we're not thinking about it. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean we can't stimulate activities via higher brain centers. For example, your heart rate rising when you're walking into your boss's office, or when you get scared watching a movie. So we can see that higher brain centers can make changes to the cardiovascular system. But as far as everyday regulation that's occurring when you're not thinking about it, it's originating from one of these three receptors. So let's go ahead and outline what happens. So, let's start with baroreceptors. Okay, what do baroreceptors monitor? Well, baroreceptors monitor blood pressure. Well, if your baroreceptors are detecting an increase in blood pressure, well, this is a bad thing, so we want to lower it. If this is the case, we need to decrease cardiac output. In order to decrease cardiac output, we do this by increasing parasympathetic stimulation, while at the same time decreasing sympathetic stimulation. Now remember, your heart, like most organs, receives dual innervation, which means it receives both sympathetic and parasympathetic signaling. So anytime we talk about modifying signaling from the autonomic nervous system, we got to reference both. And again, it's typically opposite. One's going up, one's going down. Okay? Now, if blood pressure is too low, well, then we need to increase cardiac output in order to increase blood pressure. We do this by decreasing parasympathetic but while increasing sympathetic. And from here on out, I'm simply going to use S with a circle and P with a circle so I don't have to keep writing this out. Okay. So now let's talk about chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors monitor three things. They monitor the O2 in the blood, they monitor the CO2 in the blood, and they monitor the pH. Okay, we'll talk more about chemoreceptors when we get to blood gases and the respiratory system, but for now, there are two basic ways in which these things, there are two basic situations in which these two are activated. Option one is if we have a drop in oxygen levels, which would typically correspond to an increase in CO2 levels, and when your CO2 levels go up, you're more acidic, so you'd have a drop in pH. Well, if you don't have enough oxygen, you need to get that blood circulating more quickly so it can pick up the oxygen at the lungs and deliver it to your tissues, which means we need to increase cardiac output, and we do this by decreasing parasympathetic stimulation while at the same time increasing sympathetic. If you have too much oxygen or vice versa, not enough CO2, which in this case it's the not enough CO2 that's the big problem, because your blood would be too basic. In this case, we need to decrease cardiac output because we want to stop losing our CO2 if we don't have enough as it is. And we do this by increasing parasympathetic stimulation and at the same time decreasing sympathetic. Finally, we have our proprioceptors. Now, as you recall, proprioceptors from AMP1 monitor body position and joint movement. So what are these coming into play? Why are these working? Well, let's say we all of a sudden notice increased proprioceptor activity. Well, this would mean that you'd have overall increase, or your body is assuming, so your brain assumes you are going to exercise. And if you're going to exercise, you need to increase cardiac output pretty soon, so let's get a jump start. And we do this by decreasing parasympathetic, increasing sympathetic. This is predictive. It's not a guarantee. The idea here is that if you're increasing proprioceptor activity, well, you're going to need here in a little bit more heart rate, increased heart rate. So let's just get a jump start. This is why when you climb a couple of flights of stairs, even if you're the most athletic person, you're still going to have a slight increase in your heart rate because your proprioceptors are signaling it. Vice versa, if we have a decrease proprioceptor activity, this means you're being lazy, which requires less cardiac output, which means we can increase parasympathetic stimulation, decrease sympathetic stimulation. Okay. So this is overall how we, on a daily basis, unconsciously automatically regulate different aspects to the cardiovascular system. Now, one of the things you note, I simply just said increase sympathetic, increase parasympathetic, but you will need to know all of this stuff, okay? So, if you were giving an answer like that on a test, and it simply said increase sympathetic, and that was as far as you went, you would not receive full credit, because you need to tell me what it means to increase sympathetic. The idea that it increases heart rate and increases contractility, increases cardiac output. You need to finish the thought out. Okay, I didn't have room on the sheet of paper, but you do. Now, neural regulation is not the only thing that can ultimately change activity of the heart. There are a variety of hormones that can adjust or affect cardiac activity. Epinephrine, norepinephrine will, of course, mimic the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, and you also learn that the thyroid hormones will actually result in an overall increase in heart rate due to their permissive effects with your epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. A variety of electrolytes will also lead to issues. Elevated sodium levels or hypernatremia can actually interfere with calcium delivery, which calcium delivery to the heart, which actually can decrease contractility. Okay. Elevated potassium levels or hyperkalemia is going to affect your ability to produce an action potential, which decreases your heart rate. And finally, elevated calcium levels or hypercalcemia can actually speed up your heart rate and force of contraction and lead to tachycardia, which can be very dangerous. Finally, age, gender, physical fitness, temperature, etc. Can all affect cardiac activity as well, as you'll see as you compare, your physical fitness, etc. to your grandparents or your child's. This is a nice little chart that gives you an overview of what goes on in a typical scenario, so it could be useful to you as you try and get a grasp on everything as a whole. Finally, exercise in the heart is something I want you to review on your own, just overall why exercise is important and what benefits it has to cardiovascular health. Finishing with a few questions. Now, as you recall, I said EKG was independent study, so this is going to give you a couple of questions to see if you actually did your independent study, because remember, these questions will show up on your tests and quizzes. So take a second, read through this, and see what you come up with. Pause if you need to. So, which wave is best matched correctly with its heart's activity? Well, the best answer is the ST segment is associated with ventricular depolarization. The T wave is actually ventricular repolarization. The P wave is atrial depolarization. And the QRS complex is technically ventricular depolarization. Now, technically, atrial repolarization is hidden, but it accounts for only a very small aspect to the QRS answer, and that's why this best option was the key. So, what's occurring during isovolumetric contraction? So think about your answer, see what you come up with. Pause if you need to. So, what is occurring? The amount of blood in each atria is the same. The semilunar valves are open. The point at which all blood is being ejected. All four valves are closed. Both atria are ejecting blood. Well, isovolumetric contraction, well, it's isovolumetric, meaning the volume is not changing because all four valves are closed. So that's what we see there. The amount of blood ejected from either ventricle every minute is referred to as, this is the key where students remember the equation, but not the definition. It is cardiac output. Remember, a lot of students you might be thinking stroke volume, but remember, stroke volume would be every beat. Okay, but that's often confused there. And your last question, which of the following statements is false in reference to the regulation of the heart? So take a second, pause your recording, and read through these to see what you come up with. So which of these is a false statement? At rest, parasympathetic stimulation dominates. Baroreceptors measure the amount of sodium ions. Sympathetic stimulation triggers the release of norepinephrine. Movement is detected by proprioceptors. Parasympathetic signals travel via the vagus nerve. And the correct answer is, or the false answer is, B. Baroreceptors do not detect sodium ions, they detect pressure. Now, if you don't know why A, C, D, and E are true statements, you're going to want to go back and read through your notes to come up with the correct answers. Now, I could just sit here and tell you why they're true, and I'm sure many of you want me to do that, but whether you like it or not, if you can figure out the correct answer on your own, if you can figure out why these statements are true, then you are going to retain that knowledge a lot longer than if I tell you the answer. Okay, so that is it for the heart, and you are now done with all of the lectures necessary for your first test. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I look forward to meeting you in person for that first exam.